Hey, what is going on, guys? In today's video, we're going to do a full in-depth guide of controller settings for EZFN, which is Chapter 1, Season 7. We'll cover sensitivity, we will cover some key settings in the general settings, and then we will cover binds. Now, something to keep in mind is that for controller, while there are some certain settings that are mandatory, and I'll be sure to be very clear when they are mandatory, a lot of this is going to be down to personal preference. So this is more meant to be of a general guideline of how you can set up your controller, but you want to mold this to your own personal playstyle and preferences. And with that, let's start out with X and Y sensitivity. Now, when L2 is very strong, overall I'd say that a lower base X and Y sensitivity may help you because you're going to be doing a lot of aiming while hip firing, and if it's too high, it's going to be very hard to aim at long range while doing that. But because we have the L2 cooldown right now, it's not as important because you can't really spam L2. You're going to do a lot more holding of the left trigger instead of spamming it. So overall, I'd say that's less important. It's really just finding what's comfortable for you. You're still going to be doing some L2 most likely, so you don't want to set it ridiculously high, but you just have to decide for yourself, are you going to focus on L2 or are you going to focus on general mechanics? So really a personal preference there. For me, 7.7, I've had that locked in for a long time. But you can really go as low as maybe like 0.55, or I even see people do really well as high as like 0.85, 0.9. So it's pretty free there. Targeting sensitivity. When L2 is very strong, I recommend you have your targeting sensitivity high because you're going to be spamming L2 in, out, in, out, in, out, in, out like this, right? So you want it to be as close to your base sensitivity as possible. But because of the L2 cooldown, you're not going to be spamming it anywhere near as much. So I would say that lower is going to be okay. Again, personal preference, but something to keep in mind is that this is a multiplier of your base sensitivity. So do remember that if you lower your base sensitivity, for instance, you need to raise your targeting sensitivity multiplier to compensate if you want the same effective sense. Scope sensitivity, you don't L2 with scopes realistically, so just set it with what you're comfortable with there. L2 is not a factor. And then build sensitivity, you 100% want this higher than 1.0 as building requires less overall precision than aiming. This is also going to depend a lot on your ping. You know, if I consistently play with less ping, I would probably set this higher, like 1.6. But because I play a lot on EU, it's too fast to try and do 1.6. It's just too laggy. So I set it lower. But really going to be personal preference and ping dependent there. Now, in terms of your general control options, there's a couple key settings that I really want to go over. The first one is obviously aim assist. You're going to want that on. Edit mode aim assist. This is an interesting one because I think it could be helpful if you're new. And for walls, floors, and pyramids, I actually think it's overall a decent setting. Where I think it really falls apart is stairs, because there's that little middle area where there's no editable piece, and if you try and edit through that, you just can't. You just get stuck, because it like doesn't let you go through there, if that makes sense. So I would say maybe as a beginner you try this, but as you get more experience, I'd honestly say probably not worth it. Another thing is, Builder Pro, build immediately. This is a mandatory setting. Mandatory, okay? Because what this does is when you switch pieces, you only have to press once instead of twice. That is absolutely huge because it's going to make building more responsive and faster. So you need to have this on. And vibration, I also recommend you have this off. There's no advantage to having your controller vibrate. In fact, there's probably a disadvantage because you're more likely to make mistakes when it's shaking. If it makes the game more fun for you, sure, you can have it on, but it is honestly a disadvantage. Moving on to your bindings. Bindings are going to heavily depend on the way you have your controller configured, in that you're playing maybe standard. And what I mean by standard is you don't have claw, you don't have paddle, so you're doing a lot of taking your thumb off the right stick to go to those face buttons, right? If you play claw, you'll use another finger to press those face buttons directly. And if you're using paddle configuration, you're rebinding buttons to paddles. Now for me, I use a 4 paddle configuration, which are binded to the D-pad, which means I put my key functions like switch mode, reload, edit, and toggle pickaxe all on the D-pad, which are bound to paddles, and that frees up the face buttons, which are easier to hit than the D-pad, for secondary functions like map, inventory, sprint. This is not going to be possible if you're on claw. This would make absolutely no sense. If you're on center config, also makes no sense. Really, the key thing here is you're just trying to minimize the number of times you have to take your right thumb off the stick to press a button. It's inevitable you're going to have to do that. And people that even play standard configuration are still absolutely insane. So don't think this is going to hold you back from being really good. But, you know, doing certain things like maybe you put edit on left stick to try and like make one less removal of your thumb from the stick, you know, something like that. One other thing is that I would highly recommend you have crouch instead of crouch/repair. The reason why I say that is because if you have crouch only, it's going to be more responsive because the game's not going to check for if you're holding the button to repair. Same thing with switch mode. You don't want switch mode / edit. You just want switch mode. In terms of your building configuration, I would unbind, rotate, and put crouch there instead. There are basically 0 situations where you need to rotate. If you need to drop down, you can always use the waterfalling method, which is not too difficult to do. It's just a pointless bind, so I highly recommend you have crouch. And the other thing is that the game will try and bind a lot of like the squad comms, emote. You don't need this in build mode. If you need an emote or use squad comms, go back to regular mode. You're just increasing the chance you press the wrong button. Same thing applies for edit mode. You don't need all these buttons bound to random garbage like squad comms or inventory. If you need to go to inventory, go back to regular mode. There's no reason to clog up your buttons in edit mode and just risk of pressing the wrong button. Only have bound what you actually need. And finally, in terms of dead zones, it's heavily depend on your controller. If you have a brand new controller, you might have to set it all the way down. But as your controller ages, you might have to set it higher. As a rule of thumb, I try to set it as low as possible without getting stick drift. If you prefer a little higher, maybe you want to tolerate a little bit of stick drift so it's a little more responsive, fine. But as a baseline, I'd say that's generally a good place to start. And with that, I hope this helps you, and I'll catch you in the next video.